Three of the most cruel acts inflicted on enslaved black people, and the last one will absolutely break your heart. Skinned for boots. There are records of enslaved men whose skin was used to make items like boots, not rumors, documented. Their humanity stripped, turned into trophies, and it was spoken about with pride.
Yes, there are indeed disturbing historical accounts, though not always well documented in mainstream history, describing the use of enslaved black people's skin and body parts to make clothing items like boots, purses, belts, or furniture during and after slavery in the United States. These accounts reflect one of the most dehumanizing aspects of racial violence and white supremacy in that era. Here's a breakdown of what is known and documented from historical sources, survivor testimony, and scholarly research. Context: dehumanization and atrocities. During slavery and well into the Jim Crow era, black people were often treated as property, objects of labor, experimentation, and violence. There are credible records showing that enslaved and lynched black people's bodies were sometimes mutilated and used for souvenirs. White mobs at lynchings in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were known to take body parts as trophies, including skin, fingers, and bones. Photographs of these lynchings were sometimes made into postcards and circulated. These were meant to terrorize black communities and reinforce white dominance. The use of human skin. While many accounts were oral or appeared in black newspapers and abolitionist writings, some documented claims mention human skin being tanned and turned into leather goods. Examples include abolitionist writings in the 1800s described Southern enslavers tanning the skin of enslaved men as fine leather. After the Civil War, some reports mentioned boots and saddles allegedly made from the skin of black men. Ida B. Wells, in her anti-lynching investigations, documented reports that body parts and skin from lynching victims were sometimes made into keepsakes. These horrific acts weren't widespread, but they did happen, particularly in the atmosphere of racial terror that made such mutilation a form of intimidation. During the early 1900s, multiple newspapers and NAACP reports described incidents where white mobs not only lynched, but flayed their victims. For example, in 1919, the Chicago Defender and Crisis magazine, edited by W.E.B. Du Bois, published reports of mob members making souvenirs from victims' bodies. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, created by the Equal Justice Initiative, preserves some of these accounts as part of the documented history of racial terror. These acts symbolized the ultimate erasure of humanity, turning a person into a thing. Historians and anthropologists caution that while not every specific story can be verified, these accounts are consistent with the documented culture of racial violence. The combination of mutilation, public spectacle, and the making of souvenirs serves as evidence of how deeply racial hatred was institutionalized.
Hair for furniture. Some black women were forcibly shaved, not just to shame them, but because their hair was used as stuffing for chairs and cushions. They sat on our stolen beauty. Here's the part that's hard to swallow. These weren't just punishments. They were public displays meant to break spirits. Families were forced to watch, children made to cry out. This wasn't discipline, it was domination. 1. Boiled in sugar. On some sugar plantations, the worst punishment? Being thrown into boiling sugar. It was slow, painful, deliberate, and they called it sweet justice. That's the history they hide. If they only taught us about cotton, remember the boots, the chairs, the sugar.
Yes, tragically, that is true. During slavery, especially on sugar plantations in the Caribbean and parts of South America, punishments were often unimaginably brutal. Sugar plantations were among the harshest places for enslaved Africans because sugar production was extremely labor-intensive and dangerous. The combination of boiling cauldrons of sugar, extreme heat, and relentless overseers created deadly conditions. Historical records from islands such as Jamaica, Barbados, Haiti, then Saint-Domingue, and Guyana describe cases where enslaved Africans were boiled alive in vats of sugar or cane syrup as punishment or as a way to terrorize others into submission. These punishments were meant to set an example and instill fear, but they reflected the utter dehumanization of black people under slavery. For instance, in the 18th century, Brian Edwards, a British historian of the Caribbean, documented cases in which enslaved men were thrown into boiling cane juice as punishment for rebellion or for attempting to escape. In Saint-Domingue, Haiti, French planters were known to use boiling cauldrons as part of their torture practices, something that became infamous during the Haitian Revolution when the enslaved rose up and overthrew the system. In Dutch Guiana, now Suriname, and Guyana, there are documented instances in which planters used boiling molasses or scalding ladles of syrup on enslaved workers. Sugar slavery was one of the cruelest forms of human exploitation, not just because of the physical suffering, but also because of the calculated brutality used to maintain control.